Welcome to another Mid-Range Computing Institute video. This video was shot live at the AS400 Connection Conference in Dallas, Texas. The speaker at this session is Wayne Evans. Wayne worked at the IBM Rochester Development Lab for 27 years. For the last 6 years, he specialized in security, working on the integration of System 36 and System 38 security with AS400, password expiration and validation rules, the definition of security levels, audit journals, and other AS400 features. Wayne retired in 1991 to follow a second career in speaking and teaching. His worldwide travels have firmly established him as a leading AS400 security guru. He is the owner of Wayne O. Evans Consulting Incorporated. In this session, he is speaking on AS400 Security Fundamentals, Object Authority. This video reviews object authority options and library security. It discusses the many alternative methods available to secure objects. Finally, all of these alternatives are put into perspective with a review of authority search order.
Welcome to this fourth session on security fundamentals, where we're going to spend our time talking about object authority. My name is Wayne Evans, and if you have any security-related questions, I would encourage you to contact me. My email address is evans@midrangecomputing.com, and below that you can see my normal mail address as well as my fax address. In this session we're going to be covering the authority options, what access control is, and then how the AS400 searches for authority, and finally some special topics. First, let's spend a few minutes looking at the authority that applies to all objects. These are the authority options, and there are really three groups of authority options. There is the object level authority that applies to the object as a whole, that deals with how the total object. Then there's the data authorities that describe the types of operation that's allowed. And then there's a special category which I call exclude. Exclude authority is special in that exclude authority will prevent, if you grant exclude authority to a user, that prevents a user from getting access even to the public authority to an object. So exclude authority blocks access to an object. Let's spend a few moments taking a look at the individual authority options. First, object operator authority is the authority that's required for you to look at the description of an object, or to open a file, you must also have object operator authority, and object operator authority is often included with some of the other data authorities to determine the actual access that a user might have. The authority for object existence determines whether a user can delete the object or whether they can free the object, restore the object, or transfer ownership of an object. Authorization list management authority is a very special authority that deals only with authorization lists, and with authorization list management authority you can add and remove users and their authorities to an authorization list. Object management authority is an authority which the owner grants to some other individual to allow the other individual to be able to change the security specifications of an object, to move or rename the object. Now, object management authority also includes the functionality that's included in the two database authorities, object alter and object ref. Object alter authority is a authority that applies only to database files, and with this authority the user can go out and alter the attributes of a database, add and remove triggers to a database, clear a physical file, and change the attributes of SQL packages. If you give a user object alter authority, you no longer have to give them object management authority to clear a file, so they can't change the security of the object. Object reference authority, again, a database-only authority, and this says, can you define referential integrity constraints between database objects on the system. So these are the object-level authorities. Now let's take a minute and look at the data authorities on the system. The data authorities describe the types of operations that are allowed on an object, such as the ability to read an object, view the records in a file, add authority says that you can insert new data into an object, such as messages in a message queue, adding records to a file. Update authority is that authority that allows you to change the content of an object, for essentially existing records in a file. Delete authority is the authority that allows you to remove the records from a file. This delete authority differs from the object level authority of object existence. Object existence authority allows you to delete the whole object. Delete authority simply allows you to remove individual records from the file. And the final authority is the authority of execute. This applies to programs, directories, and files. Execute authority is required in order to run a program or to be able to search through a library or a directory on the system. Now, IBM actually makes it a little simpler for us than all these individual authorities in that they've got some terms that describe multiple collections of these authorities, and these more or less describe typical operations. If you want to let someone be able to read but not modify, you will grant them use access. And use access is really object operational authority, read access, and execute access. Change authority says not only can you read, but you can modify the contents of an object, and that is object operational, and all of the data authorities: read, add, update, delete, and execute. And the final authority term is all. All includes every authority, with one exception. It does not include authorization list management authority, that's special authority for authorization lists. But with all authority, if you grant a user all authority, they can go out and delete the object, rename the object, have complete access to an object. Let's take a look here at how you might use authorities. Here we're doing a create physical file for object 1. In the AUT parameter, we're granting the public authority of use. Now we're going to give to this same object, to user profile gloop, the authorities add, object oper, and read. And to the second, we're going to use the grant object authority command again, this time for 2 user profiles, group sales and Mary, granting them change access. Then we enter the display object authority command for this object, and we see the screen below, and you'll see that since I was the one that entered the create physical file command, I have by default all authority to the object, and I am the owner of that object. User gloop was one of the users we authorized to it, and if you'll notice in the authority column, user gloop has got the authority user defined. What does user defined authority mean? User defined really is a kind of a fill in the blanks authority, that if the authority isn't all, change, use, or exclude, IBM uses the term user defined, meaning there's some combination of authorities that doesn't meet the requirements for the all, change, use, or exclude. And then here we have user profiles, group sales and Mary with change access, and finally the public authority of use. Let's go out and do a display object authority for the object Evans, and this is a library, and we would see in this display, actually, there would be 3 different screens displayed when you do the display object authority. The first screen that comes up simply shows you who's authorized to the object. If you hit the function key 11, then the data object authorities occur, and finally function key 11 again, you see the data authorities. So really, to see the authorities for an object, it requires 3 screens. Now IBM customers complained, they said, isn't there something IBM you can do, rather than you forcing us to look through 3 screens, we would prefer not to see the no detail, no authority, and is there some way that you could put all of this on one panel? Well, you can. If you change your user profile to run as user op expert, then with user op expert, you will get all of the data, all of the authorities for the object compressed onto one screen. And how did IBM accomplish this? Well, they did it by abbreviating the column headings down to one character. And so if you're an expert, you know what the data authorities are. I think of this as operating in the OMERADI form, where the OMER is the object level authorities and RADI is the data level authorities, where the O stands for object oper, M for object management, E for object existence, A for object alter, and R for object reference. And then the data authorities are read, add, update, delete, and execute. That's the OMERADI, and if you're an expert, you know what OMERADI means. Let's spend a few moments talking about access control on the AS400. Now, access control really consists of three important questions. Who are you authorizing to the data? What are you authorizing? And how is this authorization specified? Let's take a look at each one of these individually. First, who do you authorize? Who you authorize on the AS400 is quite simple. You essentially authorize user profiles or the public. Or you can also authorize a group profile, but that is just a user profile. The way the authority works is if you authorize the individual user profile, then there will not be any access to the group profile or the public. If either the group or the individual is authorized, then the user never sees the public authority. The public authority is essentially the default authority that users get if they have no other authorities. So that's who you authorize, user profiles, and the public, and the user profile could be a group profile. What do you authorize on the AS400? That's simple. You authorize objects on the AS400. You can authorize the commands of the operating system, the programs, the files, the libraries, and there are over 85 different object types that you can authorize, and you essentially authorize all of these objects the same way with these same authorities we have just talked about. So that's what we authorize. But let's take a look at one special type of object, and that's the object library. A library is a special object because it contains the addressability of other objects, and you must be authorized both to the library and to the individual object itself. So we've got an example here where we have a library that's got a file and a command in it, and you must be authorized to the library with use access. You can locate the objects in the library. If you have change access to a library, you can go out and add new objects to a library. I would recommend for production libraries, you not give your programmers change access to production libraries, because you know programmers, those programmers just tend to want to make one last change that's not going to hurt anything, and they insert the new object into there, and you can guess that change that didn't hurt anything causes production to go down. The authorities to an object will determine the types of operations that are allowed. Let's take a look at an example here and see if you understand the use of object authority and library authority. Remember, you must be authorized to both the library and the object. Here we have an example of library tools with user 1 having all authority to library tools and the public having use authority to library tools. Inside of library tools, we have object A, for which the public authority is all. And the question you need to ask is, what users can access object A? Can user 1 access it? Can user 2 access it? And can the public access object A? Well, it's really a question is, can the user access the library, and can the user access the object? Well, in the case of users 1, 2, and the public, all of these users have access to the library because of either user 1 is explicitly authorized to the library, the rest of the users get the public access to the library, and for the object itself, everyone has access. So if you thought that everyone could access object A, you were correct. Let's take a look at object B. Object B, user 1 has exclude access and the public is use. And so if we ask the question, what users have access to object B, if you correctly said that user 1 has no access, the user 2 has access, and the public has access, that is correct. Let's take a look at another object in this same library. Object C, in which user 2 has use access, the public has exclude access. Again, asking what users have access. Well, for object C, the answer is only user 2 has access to object C. Let's take a look at another library and ask the question, who has access to object D in library sales? For library sales, user 2 has use access, the public is exclude, and for object D, user 1 has change access to the object, and the public is excluded. Let's ask the question, who has access to object D? Don't get fooled. Think before you respond. Who does have access to object D? It turns out if you said and have determined that no one has access, that is correct. And you say, but Wayne, I can see by looking at object D, user 1 has access to object D. That is correct. User 1 is authorized to object D, but is user 1 authorized to library sales? No. Only user 2 is authorized to library sales, and user 2 is not authorized to object D, so the correct answer is nobody is authorized to object D. Is this a good security example? No. Can it exist on your AS400? Yes, it can. So you have to be careful to look at both the authority to the object and to the authority to the library. Let's look at one last object in library sales, and that is object E. And the public authority for object E is all. And let's ask the question, who has access to object E? Well, you have to have access both to the library and to the object itself. Only user 2 has access to the library, so only user 2 can access object E. This example of object E is an example of a second security strategy on the system. And this second security strategy essentially says what we are going to do is we're going to try to secure a library. This is often called library security, and with library level security, you're going to use public access for the objects and restrict access to the library to control access to the object. This is the second mechanism to control access. The first one was that of menu level security for the limit capability user. Library level security is the second level and is an easy way to manage security. It has the advantage over menu level security in that it can even restrict users that are using other access methods such as client access or coming in over communication lines. If they're not authorized to the library, they cannot get at the data in that library. If you need better control, then you can not only put the authority at the library level, but on the individual objects themselves. Let's look at a common misunderstanding relative to AS400 security. Let's talk about the authority that's needed to create or add objects to a library, and then contrast that to the authority that's needed to delete an object. Here we have a library for which user 1 has all, the public authority is use. We've got file A in this library with a public authority of all, and we want to add this file new to the library. We ask the question, who can add this file new to the library? Well, to add an object to a library, you actually have to have add authority to that library. And so we're really asking the question, who has add authority to this library? Well, in this case, user 1 having all authority gives user 1 the adequate access. So only user 1 is allowed to add this object. So let's say user 1 creates object new in the library and assigns to that object public change authority. Then let's ask the next question. Now that we've got objects A and new in this library, who can delete these objects? First, looking at object A, we see the public authority is all. User 1 has all authority to the library the public has used. What users can delete object A? If you answered every user, that is correct, because essentially even users 2 and the public, because of the public entry on the library, have enough access to get through the library controls, and then the public authority of all would let anyone delete object A. When we talk about who can delete object new, well, the public can't delete object new because change access isn't enough. Only user 1 is allowed to delete object new. This is a common misunderstanding among most AS400 users. Essentially, you have to have authority of add to insert new objects in a library, but to delete objects in the library, all you need to be able to do is to find the address of the object, and the authority on the object itself, the object existence authority on the library or on the object, is all that's required. I wished that IBM would require that you had to have delete authority to the library, but I don't think IBM will change at this late date on the AS400's future. Let's now look at how do you authorize objects. There are several mechanisms, and we'll talk about each of these mechanisms to different techniques of granting access or allowing users to access an object. And let's take a look at each one of these individually. First, explicit authority. Up to this point, I've really been using explicit authority in most examples, and that is authority that you're going to grant directly to a user. This is sometimes called private authorities because it is authority that's stored in the user profile. And essentially the commands to define the explicit authority for an object are the grant object authority and the revoke object authority. There's also a command called edit object authority that gives you an interactive interface that really runs the grant object authority and revoke object authority functionality under the interface of the system. There are two commands, grant DLO authority and revoke DLO authority. These deal with some very special object types called document library objects. Document library objects are unique on the AS400 in that they have a 12-character name, whereas most AS400 objects only have a 10-character name. Why did IBM invent DLOs, or document library objects? They invented them to provide access for PC programs. If you think about the old DOS programs, they had an 8-character name, a period, and a 3-character extender, and therefore IBM came up with the concept of document library objects with a 12-character name. The document object will map directly to a PC file. The folder maps directly to a PC directory, and because you can see that folders can be within folders, in this command here we've got folder A, folder B, and then finally document C that we're going to grant access to. The last thing you can do when you're granting access, you can grant access to the public as well as to user profile, and when you create an object, you can use the AUT parameter to define the public authority. Let's look at another mechanism for granting access to an object called an authorization list. An authorization list is an object that is used to essentially, it's really two lists. It's a list of users and their access and a list of objects. The users on the authorization list are authorized to the objects on the authorization list, and their authority is determined by the authorization list. Let's take a look at how you might add a user to an authorization list. Well, to add a user to an authorization list, you do need to have authorization list management authority. Since user profile Evans has authorization list management authority, I can enter the command add authorization list entry, naming the authorization list and the user profile, and I'm going to be granting new user use access, and this then gives new user since new user gets added to the authorization list, then new user is authorized to objects A, B, C, and D. How do you add an object to an authorization list? Well, there are really three ways. For new objects, when you do a create command to create a new object, in the AUT parameter, rather than specifying the public authority, you can name an authorization list, and that will immediately secure this object by the authorization list. Or when you create an object, you can default or specify the authority to be library create authority, and then based upon the library, if the library defines an authorization list, the object will be secured by the authorization list. Or if you already have an object that exists that is not secured by an authorization list, you can use the grant object authority. You can name the object and the object type, and then use the AUTL parameter, naming the authorization list. And essentially, who can define users or add objects to an authorization list? Anyone can add an object to an authorization list that is allowed to change the authority for an object. To change the authority for an object, you must either be the owner of the object or have authorization list management authority. And you can actually add objects to an authorization list, even if you aren't authorized or don't appear on that authorization list. Let's take a look at how the library create authority works relative to libraries and new objects. For a library, let's say library sales, we're going to define for library sales its create authority to be sales list. The default for most libraries is *sysval, where they get the public authority from the system value Q create authority. But for library sales, we have changed the create authority for library sales to be sales list. And now when we create a new object into library sales and saying that we're going to use the authority, library create authority in the AUT parameter, and by the way, this is the default for most create operations, then when the new object gets created into library sales, the system looks at the library create authority, sees the authorization list sales list is named for library sales, and so new object immediately gets added to the sales authorization list. Let's spend a few minutes talking about authority holders. Now, authority holders apply only to 36 type application. For those of you that aren't running 36 type applications, then you really have no need to be bothered with authority holders, but listen anyway so that you can appreciate what the 36 user goes through. Essentially, let's talk a little bit about a 36 application. 36 applications have a kind of standard pattern. What they do is they will take a database file, they will make a copy of the database file, they'll sort the file into the desired order, then they will delete the original file and rename the original sorted file back into its sorted form from the system. And for those of you that are familiar with 36, you recognize that this is a typical flow that most 36 applications go through. But there's a problem. Assuming that you've secured the file up at the top in that appears in step 1, and at step 3 you delete the file. At step 3, when you deleted the file, all the authority that you added to the file is lost. Well, this was not a desirable situation, so IBM invented the concept of an authority holder. What is an authority holder? Well, an authority holder is an object, and the purpose of the authority holder is to, as its name implies, to hold the authority even while a file has been deleted. So for this 36 application that we're going to be deleting the file frequently on, we're going to go out and create an authority holder for that file, and then thereafter you do all your grants of access to the file itself, and because the file has an authority holder, IBM will remember the authorities in that authority holder even while the file is deleted. So when you rename the sorted copy of the file, back to the original name, then all the authority gets restored and the ownership is even transferred back to its original owner. How do you create authority holders? Well, as you might have guessed, the create authority holder command, and you name the authority holder and the library that it goes in, and after the authority holder is created, you do all of your grant and revoke and your accesses based upon the file itself. The authority holder just sits around in the background remembering the authority for that authority holder. Now, some of you say, well, this would be very nice functionality. Why don't we have this on all objects? This is limited just to 36 objects because AS400 objects you don't create and delete as frequently as 36 objects. Let's look at the fourth way of granting access to an object, that is program adoption of authority. Program adoption of authority is a special feature of AS400 that says while a user is running a program, the user gets the authority of the owner of the program for both the authority of their object, and if the owner of the program also has a special authority, that authority is granted. Only while the user is running the program. And so the program can control what functions the user can do, and it can enforce such things as the size of a transaction, or maybe let a user perform certain accesses for individual libraries. Let's take a look at how adopted authority works, but first let's take a look at an example where the user doesn't have adopted authority. Here we have a user that wants to be able to run program 1. Program 1 calls program 2, and program 2 updates the payroll file and file B. In this case, the user has to be authorized to program 1, program 2, the payroll file, and file B. So without adopted authority, this user has to be authorized to all of the objects. This can either be coming through their individual user profile, their group profile, or the public, but the user has authority to all of the objects. Let's take a look at this same example. This time, we're going to change program 1 to have program 1 adopt its owner's authority. In this case, then user 1 only needs to be authorized to run program number 1. While the user is running program number 1, the authority of the owner of the program is adopted, and so if the owner of this program is authorized to program 2, the payroll file and file B, then the user 1, while running program 1, can continue to perform these operations. This is a concept called adoption of authority, and it has some vast improvements on security. And why is it good? Well, this illustrates very carefully the difference. If, in fact, in the case where we didn't use adopted authority, we gave the user access to program 1, program 2, the payroll file, and file B, then the user can access this payroll file, run queries against it, run other applications against the payroll file. But in the case where we had program adopted authority and the user was only authorized to program 1, if the user tried to access the file through a query or through other mechanisms outside of the program 1 that adopted authority, the user would be prevented access. So adopted authority eliminates our need to have to grant users access to the object all the time. Let's look at one last way to give users access on the machine, and that's giving them the special authority of all object special authority. All object special authority gives the users unrestricted access to all of the objects on the machine. And yes, all object authority is a dangerous authority, gives them godlike privileges, and you don't want to give them all object authority. So we've talked about access control. We've talked about who is authorized, user profiles, group profiles, and the public. What is authorized? It's the objects on the machine, and we've talked about the different mechanisms for specifying access, explicit authority, authorization list, authority holders, program adoption authority, and all object authority. Well, this is the access control on the system, but really many of you are probably asking the question, well, how does the system search for authority? Does it make a difference on how I specify authority? And the answer to the question is yes. Let's spend a few moments looking at the authority search mechanisms of the AS400. First, let's talk about what the rules are. The authority search order is essentially the rule that IBM applies is whenever it finds authority at any level, it's going to stop. The first place it searches is the user profile, and it asks you to have access there. If you don't have any access, then it will go on and look at your group profile and your supplemental group profiles. If you don't have any access at the group level, then you will get the public authority. So it's first user, then group, then public. If you still don't have any access or adequate access, then the system goes on and looks for the adopted authority. Now, when it's checking the authority for the user, it has a very strict order in which it goes out and makes that check. The first check that IBM makes is, does the individual user profile have all object authority, in which case the user gets all access. And then it says, is the user have an explicit authority or a private authority to an object, in which case then it will give him that authority, or it will check for the user on the authorization list. If you don't find any authority for the user, you fall through, and if the user has a group profile, it's going to ask the same questions about the group profile. Does the group profile have all object authority? Is the profile authorized to the object, or is the user profile on the authorization list? If the user has multiple group profiles, then it will go on and check all of the supplemental group profiles to determine what the user's access is. If you have no authority either at the user level or at the group level, then it will continue on and it will check the public authority. And it checks the public authority for an object. It essentially says, looking at the object, does the object say that the public authority is *AUTL? What is *AUTL? This is a special designation that the system is to get the public authority from the public entry on the authorization list. If it's not *AUTL, it's actually going to use the public authority specification in the object itself. Keeping these search orders in mind again, and essentially let's summarize them. It's first the user, then the group, then the public. The first thing it looks for in the user is all object authority, then authority to the object, and authority to the authorization list. The same search order for the group profiles. Here's an example where we have some user profiles: Al, Bob, Chuck, Don, and Ellen. Chuck and Don have a group profile of group sales, and Ellen, who is my wife, has a group profile of the security officer. We can see in these user profiles where they have their special authorities, and where Bob has got authority, Chuck, Don, Ellen, and the group profile also has an authority. So let's ask the question, for object X, who is authorized and what authority do they get for these objects? And I would encourage you to stop a tape and spend a few minutes thinking about who has access to these objects. First, for object X. Al has authority to object X, and how does Al get an authority? Well, let's actually perform the search algorithm for Al. The system is going to go to Al's user profile and ask the question, does Al have all object authority? No. Is Al authorized to object X? No. Is Al on the authorization list? Well, X doesn't have an authorization list. That's a quick check. How about Al's group? Al doesn't have a group, so we would go for Al. Al will then get the public authority of use for object X. Doing the same thing for object X for user Bob. When the system makes a check for Bob being authorized to the object, it sees the entry in Bob's user profile, so Bob has use authority, this time coming from the explicit or private authority in Bob's user profile. Chuck also has an authority to object X, and Chuck's access to object X is read. Don to object X. The system is first going to look at Don's user profile, and it won't find anything for Don, but when it goes to Don's group, it will see that Don's group has change access, so Don gets change access to object X. For user Ellen, Ellen isn't explicitly authorized to object X, but Ellen's group profile, the security officer, has all object authority, so Ellen gets all authority to object X. So the authorities that you would expect to see for object X are for Al, use, Bob, use, coming from Bob's user profile, Chuck, read from his user profile, Don from the group profile, and Ellen having all authority. Let's now look at object Y. Object Y has an authorization list called sales, and Bob, Chuck, group sales, and there's a public authority of read on the sales authorization list, and the public authority for object Y is *AUTL. Now let's go for object Y and ask who has access. Well, for Al is the guy that's always going to be getting public authority, but it actually is going to do it by first checking, does Al have all object? Is Al authorized to the object? Does Al appear on the authorization list? No. Then how about Al's group? Well, Al doesn't have a group, so it looks at the public authority. Seeing the public authority is *AUTL, then it looks at the public authority of read on the sales authorization list. So Al's authority to object Y is read. For Bob, we would see that Bob appears on the sales authorization list with all access, so Bob's access to object Y is all. Chuck also appears on the authorization list with exclude access, so Chuck is prevented from getting any access to object Y. For Don, let's spend just a minute and see how Don works. First, we're going to look at Don's user profile. Does Don have all object? No. Is Don authorized to the object? Does Don appear on the authorization list? No. Does Don have a group? Yes. Does Don's group have all object? No. Is Don's group authorized to the object? No. Does Don's group profile, group sales appear on the authorization list? Yes. So Don's authority is change for object Y from the group sales entry on the authorization list. Looking at object Ellen, doing that search, what is Ellen's access to object Y? Well, we see that Ellen has an exclude entry in her user profile, so Ellen is excluded from object Y. We'll spend more time talking about that in a little while. Let's take a look at another object, object Z. Object Z is secured by the same authorization list, but is the authority for object Z exactly like object Y? Well, let's check. Let's go back to Al. Al's the person that's going to get the public authority. Looking at object Z, we see that the public authority for object Z is use, and that will be Al's authority to object Z is use access. For Bob, Bob appears on the sales authorization list, but the search order is, it's going to look at Bob's user profile first and see that there is a Z entry in Bob's user profile of use access, so Bob's access to object Z is use. For Chuck, Chuck doesn't have any authority in his user profile, but Chuck does appear on the authorization list with exclude access, so for object Z, Chuck is excluded from object Z. For Don, for object Z, Don has an entry in a private authority in his user profile of all, so Don's access to object Z is all. And Ellen, for object Z, Ellen doesn't have any access, so it goes to her group profile, and because her group profile has all object authority, Ellen has all authority for object Z. Did you understand all of these authorities? If you did, you've really got a very good picture of the AS400 security, because in this example here, this is a rather a complex example, but it really illustrates the use of group profiles, the use of authorization lists, the use of private authorities, and essentially the special authority for LN of all object authority. So we've really got, if you understand this example, you really have a pretty good feeling for AS400 security search order. Let's now spend a few moments on a special topic and talk about user Ellen. Now, Ellen is a very clever user. I actually think she's kind of sneaky. And essentially, Ellen has got exclude authority to object Y, and we're going to ask the question, how could sneaky Ellen get access to object Y? Can you think of a way, if you were sneaky Ellen, that you might get access? There certainly has to be some hackers out there in video land. How could Ellen get access? If Ellen tried to grant herself access to object Y, she would get a message, Ellen, you cannot change that authority entry to object Y because you're not authorized to object Y. Well, I think sneaky Ellen can get access. Can you think of a way? Well, if you recognized that Ellen's group profile is a security officer with all object and SecAdmin special authority, what does SecAdmin special authority do? SecAdmin special authority allows you to create a user profile, and you know Ellen, she'd create Ellen the Sneak, making Ellen the Sneak a member of the security officer group. And so as Ellen the Sneak, she would have access to object Y, not as user Ellen. Why could she create the Sneak user profile? She creates the Sneak user profile because her group profile had SecAdmin special authority. Now as Sneak, she can get access to object Y. There is another technique that Ellen could use, and that relies on the fact, again, that her group profile has SecAdmin. What could she do other than creating a second user profile? Well, what's the authority search order? What does the system look for first? The system checks for all object first, so Ellen could actually change her user profile by adding all object special authority, and then Ellen, without a second user profile, could then get access to object Y. So because her group profile had SecAdmin, allowed Ellen to create either the Sneak user profile or to change her own user profile by giving herself all object authority, and therefore sneaky Ellen got access to object Y. Let's spend a little bit more time talking about this and ask, how might we block a powerful user such as user Ellen? And this, we're going to change it just a little bit so Ellen has a group profile that has special authority of all object only. Since Ellen doesn't have SecAdmin special authority in the group profile, therefore she can't go out and create Ellen the Sneak and can't change her own user profile. And we see Ellen has an exclude entry in her user profile for payroll, but we have to ask the question, can Ellen get access to the payroll file? Well, we have to ask, what other methods might Ellen use, because Ellen's a very clever user, to get access to the payroll file? We might have to block access to other functions. One of the things we're going to have to keep Ellen from doing is if there are any programs that adopt their owner's access that access the payroll file, Ellen has access to those programs. We would have to block access to every program that adopts. More than that, if there are job descriptions that allow running of jobs as other user profiles, then Ellen could use those job descriptions on the system because she's authorized to the job descriptions. We'd also have to keep her from going out and creating new job descriptions or changing existing job descriptions, or actually Ellen is authorized to every user profile in the system, so Ellen could run jobs as other users. My conclusion is, because Ellen's group profile has all object authority, it is in theory possible to block Ellen from the payroll file, but it's practically impossible because of all of the ways that Ellen can possibly get access. So our strategy here in this case is going to be one that we're going to, rather than try to block Ellen, we're going to log what Ellen does. Now, actually, you might want to consider this to be yourself, so that you are a very powerful user as security officers. Here is a technique where I go out and I log what users are doing. I'm going to do it the following way. I create a user profile that gives them powerful access, such as all object authority, and for user profile Ellen, I give them that group profile. But I say this user is limit capability, yes, so this user can't enter commands, and I give them an initial program that's going to show them a menu that gives them the normal operations they're going to try to do, such as managing users, managing objects. But look at menu option number 70 to enter commands. While the user is not allowed to enter commands normally, I give this user menu option 70. When you run menu option 70, it runs the initial menu. Program 1 actually calls the program called LOGCMD, and LOGCMD gives the user access to the command entry screen for those unexpected cases. Here is the actual functionality of the LOGCMD function. It goes out and shows the user a command entry screen, and you do this by sending a request message, and then you can execute the commands by calling the API qcommand_exec, but we're going to log what the user does, and this is through doing a send journal entry through to the audit journal. This AS400 has an alternative method of logging commands, but this is the detailed code that you would need to allow a user, even though they are a limited capability user, if you give them access to this program, it will allow them to run commands. And if you'll notice at the very bottom of the program, there's a send journal entry command that will actually go out and log those commands. So you can enter this program in and let it run. Now, what is the difference between using this LOGCMD function and using the AS400 function? Well, AS400 function is a system-provided function. You define it by saying change user profile auditing, name the user profile, and turn on command auditing. What that's going to do, that's going to generate IBM entries in the audit journal of type T. It's going to record every command the user enters, but it's also going to record commands that if a user chooses menu options that execute commands, they will be logged as well. And if they call CL programs, those CL programs will get logged as well. It turns out this may generate too much detail that you may not want to ignore. The difference is with the LOGCMD, this user application that I've illustrated for you, the entry type will be generated will be a U for user type entry, and it will only generate or log the commands that the user enters when they choose option 70. So they will be able to go out and control that, a little finer control over that logging of commands. We ask the question, is there data on the AS400 that is not protected by object level authority? The answer to the question is yes. The AS400 authority we've been talking about so far applies to objects, but there are some non-objects. Things that aren't considered objects on the AS400, such as the jobs, system values, network attributes, the spool files in the system, records in a file, and fields in a record. These are not objects, so they are not protected by the authority mechanisms we were talking about so far. So if you can't use access control to protect these non-objects, does it mean that there's no protection for them? No, that's not true. While you can't explicitly go out and grant access to a non-object, you can protect non-objects by protecting some other mechanisms. One of the other mechanisms is the special authorities. For jobs, system values, and network attributes, a special authority is required to access these non-objects. For the other non-objects, such as spool files, records in a file, fields in a record, you have to be authorized to some other file. Let's first take a look at an example of this relative to how are spool files secured. Well, we cannot secure the individual spool files, but all spool files exist on output queues, and the output queue is an object, so we can use object level authority to secure the access. You have to be able to have access to the output queue to look at the spool file. And actually the attributes of the output queue are going to control who has access to the output queue. And for output queues that are sensitive and are secured, you want to use display data no. This says that users such as the operators that have job control can't go out and look at these spool files on this output queue. Opera control no says that operators can't move or change the order of the spool files on this output queue. Authority check asterisk owner says that only the owner of the output queue is allowed to have access to these spool files, and making the public authority exclude to this output queue will block access to the output queue and thereby protect the spool files. Only the owner of the spool files and the owner of the output queue will have access to the spool files. With one exception, you see it there on your screen, if you give users spool control authority, this gives them unrestricted access to any spool file in the system. So you want to be careful to limit the number of users that have spool control access on your machine. So let's conclude this session that we've talked about object authorities, and essentially for those of you, let's make sure that when you're thinking about securing objects, don't try to protect everything. Only lock up the things that are necessary. And when you're protecting objects, try to use library level security. That's a good mechanism for protecting object rather than managing it at the individual object level. Then use group profiles and authorization lists, because this will simplify your security management. Other things that I recommend for managers is make sure you have a written security policy and a security awareness program. And finally, these are the manuals supplied by IBM. This completes the AS400 Security Fundamentals Object Authority presentation. And I hope that you found this useful. My name is Wayne Evans. You can contact me at evans@midrangecomputing.com. And this is my telephone number if you have any AS400 security questions. Have a good day and good securing of your AS400.